Welcome to the NJ Criminal Podcast.
Today I have the pleasure of speaking with Glenn Garrels. Glenn is an expert in the field of use of force, and he is the owner and operator of Force Analysis, LLC, and is a use of force consultant. So, Glenn, I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you so much for taking the time today to join us.
Oh, good afternoon, Meg. Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it.
I know that you could probably talk all day about use of force, but why don't you first tell us a little bit about your background and what it is that you do?
Well, I'm just getting ready to start my 22nd year in the state police. I'm currently assigned to the Casino Gaming Bureau in Atlantic City. For the first probably 4.5, 5 years of my career, I was a road duty trooper in uniform, assigned to several road duty stations in Troop A, which is South Jersey. I made detective shortly after that and was assigned to the Digital Technology Investigations Unit, where I investigated crimes against children for a year. And then shortly after that, I was transferred to the Major Crime Unit, where I spent basically the next 14 years of my career investigating homicides, suspicious deaths, and officer-involved shootings, which is instances of deadly force by police.
And is that how you really got into becoming an expert in the area of use of force?
Yes, by being in the Major Crime Unit, we're automatically assigned to the Attorney General's shooting response team, where we had to handle or investigate all the state police deadly force instances. And back then, anytime a detective or an officer from a task force or a local prosecutor's office was involved in a shooting, we had to handle those investigations as well. So over those 14 years, I was probably involved with close to 100 officer-involved shootings and in-custody deaths. And during those 14 years, I attended training all over the country in investigating officer-involved shootings and use of force, the standard behind force, and as well as a lot of the human factor science that's come up in the last 20 years regarding force, such as like human reaction times and physiological effects that can occur during use of force instances.
Now, a couple months ago, the Attorney General for New Jersey revised New Jersey's use of force policy for the first time in a couple decades. Is that correct?
Yes, he did.
Okay. And so what I'd like you to do, if you don't mind, is tell us about the new policy. And I know it's a long policy, and I know it has a lot of meat to it. But how it compares to the former policy that was in effect for a couple decades. And I guess I should start off by saying, obviously, this new use of force policy was enacted in part as a response or due to the death of George Floyd and others. Is that accurate?
That's correct. Yes, I think it was already in the making, but it certainly sped up the process to really put it in motion at that point.
Okay, so I'm going to turn it over to you. I mean, I don't know if you want to talk about what the policy used to be like, or if you want to just jump right in and talk about how the policy is now and how it differs. But tell us about use of force.
Well, I'll start off by saying the federal standard of force is objective reasonableness by a police officer. That's all from the 1989 United States Supreme Court case of Graham versus Connor. And the previous policy was based on that reasonableness. And now the new policy still goes by Graham versus Connor and objective reasonableness, but it's certainly restricted a lot of the things that officers can do now when it comes to use of force. The new policy is based on 7 core principles, which that we did not have before. And it's certainly, instead of reasonableness, it's now necessary, reasonable, and proportional for what an officer can do in any use of force instance, whether it's deadly or non-deadly, or whatever force option that they do use. So things are certainly restricted more. The policy isn't bad. It's certainly, you have to really understand it and dive into it. It has a lot of new definitions that were introduced this time around that weren't there before. So basically the policy before was probably 7 or 8 pages. Now it's probably close to 25, if not more pages of information. Be
even longer than that, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, so you really have to dive in and understand what you can do and what you can't do under certain circumstances. Again, the standard is still reasonableness. They just kind of restricted things depending on the circumstance of what's going on in each particular case, because that's you got to be careful because each use of force incident is different. No case is exactly alike. Every officer is different. Every other subject is different. So you really have to take in the totality of the circumstances of each individual case. And what happens a lot now is the public and the media, and a lot of times the command staff of a police department, go solely based on what they see in a video. And a use of force incident is so much more than watching body cam video or a video from a in-car recorder or even video surveillance somewhere. You really have to take in everything that happens, and that includes the officer's account of what he did and why he did it, witnesses, injuries that are sustained, understanding everything that happens during the circumstance and incident instead of just going by video. So that's probably my biggest thing I want to point out today is it's not just watching video. It's a lot more than that.
Right. And I guess, we could talk also or even another time about the new policy on body-worn cameras. And I know that there was a period of time where the new policy was going to preclude officers from viewing their body-worn camera prior to writing their report. Now, I think that either has changed or there's been something in the works about having that changed. But why do you think it's important to not just focus on body-worn camera video?
Because when you're watching the video of an incident, you're getting the perspective and the perspective only of the video. You're not getting necessarily the perspective of the officer. You don't know what he is perceiving at the time. You don't know what his perception is and what he's focused on visually, mentally, and possibly auditorily. You have to really understand everything that's going on. It's not just watching video. There's a lot of human factor science that may be involved in cases. It's certainly not every single case, but you have to understand everything. You're only getting the perspective of the video, not necessarily the officer.
So the new policy focuses on de-escalation, proportionality. Were they factors that were important in the old policy?
They didn't specifically mention de-escalation, but that's certainly a topic that's kind of going across the country now. And I think a lot of officers were a little bit apprehensive about it. And as I was too, because anytime you have something new, especially when it comes to use of force, you're apprehensive. When I went through the training and you read through the policy, I certainly understand where the Attorney General's office is coming from. I mean, we have to face it, that today's policing world is changing, and the officers have to change with it. The problem is when you have experienced officers who have 15, 20, 25 years on, you can't just expect them to change overnight on their ideology and thinking. It takes time to do that. And the training that was given on de-escalation is only a day or a day and a half long. It probably takes more than that to really get it ingrained into their heads on how to do this.
Well, and I would imagine it's so fact sensitive.
It is, because every case is different. Every officer is different. And again, every subject is different. So you really have to take in their accounts of what's going on. And that starts off right from when an officer is dispatched to a scene. Right then, they start formulating their perceptions of what's going on or what may have happened. And then you have to take into effect how it changes when he gets there. What new information does he find out? What happens with him and the subject when he gets on scene? How does it change? There's a lot of things that happen that you really have to pay attention to and kind of examine, and the totality of the circumstances, because that's the standard under Graham versus Connor, and still the standard under the Attorney General's guidelines now. They have it right in their policy that they understand Graham versus Connor, but they wanted to restrict things a little bit more, which they did, and it's okay because police officers can still do their job and do it effectively. I think some of them are still a little bit apprehensive until they get used to the policy.
The policy also, as you said, it's got these 7 core principles. One of the core principles focuses specifically on the use of deadly force. So there's use of force and then there's use of deadly force. Can you describe if and when an officer would ever be permitted to use deadly force?
Well, if he believes that there's an imminent threat of death or seriously bodily injury to him or someone else, it's certainly justified to use deadly force. That's why it's so important not just to watch the video. You have to understand his perception at the time that the force is used, because that's what the standard says. It's his perception as long as it's reasonable. So you have to understand what he's thinking and why he's thinking that. And obviously it's up to him or her to explain why he's thinking that, because he's the one on scene. We can sit back and watch a video in 2020 hindsight and Monday night quarterback an officer. And we have the luxury of play, rewind, play, rewind, play, rewind, and keep doing that. He potentially has a split-second judgment to make a decision on the circumstances that are tense, uncertain, and rapidly evolving. And that's what Graham versus Connor says. You have to analyze the situation from an officer on scene at the moment, knowing what he knew or she knew, not just by watching video. It's so much more entailed than that.
The new policy also requires and speaks about the duty of other officers to intervene, duty of officers to provide medical treatment if needed, duty to report. Can you maybe go over that? And is that a completely new principles that have been added since the policy that was in effect since 2000?
They were still there before, but now it's more pronounced. Where they have a whole separate core of principles set to each of those topics, and they were just mentioned in the previous Attorney General's guidelines.
That sounds like it's in a direct response to the George Floyd killing.
That and other cases that have happened around the country. But you got to remember, as horrific as the George Floyd incident was, most of the country was just watching it on video. They really didn't understand or know the entire circumstances of the case. Now, when that officer went to trial, he was found guilty, and he should have been found guilty for what happened.
Right.
But you can't always determine just from watching video. You have to really understand all the facts of the case, what they were feeling at the time, what the other officers were thinking, what they were doing, interviews of other witnesses and other video from different perspectives. There's just a lot that you really have to understand when it comes to force. But, in the last policy, we still had a duty to report force. We still had a duty to provide medical aid.
I think it's difficult for a less senior officer to intervene if he or she feels that a more senior officer is not complying with the guideline or directive.
I'm quite sure that's certainly going to go through their head, and that split-second decision. But you know what? We take an oath when we get our badge and when we graduate the academy, and that's part of our oath to uphold the law. And if you think that an officer is doing something, breaking the law or the policy itself, you have a duty to intervene. And if you don't, then you could be just as held accountable as the officer that's possibly utilizing unreasonable force.
Don't forget to subscribe and like the show on iTunes, Spotify, and anywhere you listen.